Welcome to our daily Bible study where we are currently studying the book of Acts, and today we're going to read and study from Acts chapter 17 and from verse 1 down to verse 9. But before we unpack that together, let's just make sure we're familiar with our passage today by reading that together now. So Acts chapter 17 and from verse 1 down to verse 9. Now when they had travelled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and setting before them that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, This Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is that Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a great multitude of the God-fearing Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews, becoming jealous, taking along some wicked men from the marketplace and forming a mob, set the city in an uproar and attacking the house of Jason. They were seeking to bring them out of the assembly. And when they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brothers before the city authorities, shouting, These men who have upset the world have come here also. And Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And they disturbed the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things. And when they had received the bond from Jason and the others, they released them. Now, of course, just making sure that we're reading this in context, this is Paul's second missionary journey. Here he is with Silas and Timothy, and having just left Luke in Philippi, where they had got forced out of, really. If you remember, Paul had with his missionary team had gone to Philippi, where they'd met Lydia and was staying with Lydia, and it was a small Jewish population. It wasn't enough to have a synagogue there, so they was meeting outside the gate by the river, and it was there where they met this fortune-telling slave, if you remember, where Paul cast out the demon of her, which made the ability of her being able to first of all be a fortune teller, but second of all make a huge profit for her slave owners. And because of that, they become very disgruntled and ended up speaking to the authorities, which led to the apostle Paul being placed into prison, which is the set of sovereign circumstances where the Philippian jailer and his family ended up being converted. And of course, as a result of that, Paul ends up getting released, and then he tells them about being he's actually a Roman citizen. He didn't have an opportunity to say that in his defense because he wasn't given one. He was beaten with rods and placed in prison before even being asked his side of the situation. But having spent the night in jail, well, half a night in jail, the other half at the Philippian jailer's house, having food and having his wounds dressed, and baptizing and speaking about the Lord to the family. In the morning, when he was told he was a free man, he dropped the bomb on those authorities by saying that he was a Roman citizen. And as a result of that, they realised that they were potentially in really big trouble, because it was extremely dodgy ground treating a Roman citizen in such a way, because there was all of these different rules for a Roman citizen. And now realising that they treated Paul and Silas so badly as Roman citizens, they wanted to get rid of them as quick as possible and sweep this all under the carpet. So they kept on asking them to leave. And as a result of that, after they'd gone back to Lydia's house and had seen the brothers, they encouraged this home church in Philippi, this brand new church that had been planted in Philippi that we'll be hearing about later on in Paul's letters, in his letter to the Philippians. The Philippian church in the Epistle of Philippians, the book of the Bible. And it's now that Paul sets off west of Philippi as he heads to Thessalonica. So that's where we find ourselves today, Acts chapter 17 from verse 1. Now, what do? Well, starting off in Philippi, they head west to their first destination, where they travel through Amphipolis, which is 32 miles west of Philippi. They don't stop there. They continue traveling. Amphipolis didn't have a synagogue. It wasn't a place that had enough of a Jewish community to be able to sustain a synagogue, and neither did their next destination, Apollonia. They passed through there as well, which was 32 miles west of Amphipolis. So 32 miles, 64 miles west, and then 40 miles further on from there, They arrive in Thessalonica, which is a tourist destination today. Thessalonica, a place where people go on holiday in Greece today. This was now the destination, and this was a much larger community. This had around 200,000 people living there at that time, and also a sizable Jewish community, which meant that there was a synagogue. And of course, what was Paul's custom? He would always go to the Jew first. So the first thing he would do is seek out this Jewish community, because it was low-hanging fruit. He knew that they already had an awareness of the Hebrew scriptures. It was their application that was wrong. They had a belief of self-righteousness, that this all pointed to themselves and the law and their obedience to it, but they was missing the biggest piece of the puzzle, where actually all of the law pointed towards the Lord Jesus Christ. But he knew that if he could get an audience with them, which was always the custom, if you was a visitor of good reputation in the synagogue, you would always be given an opportunity to speak and to give your portion to those that were those other Jewish believers in Judaism on the day of the Sabbath. And that's exactly what Paul was looking for the opportunity to do. So he travelled on that first Sabbath, which is the Saturday, the last day of the week, the Sabbath meeting at the synagogue. And this is what we find them do now. So this is they're just coming towards the end of verse 1. They came to Thessalonica, and where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, verse 2, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths he reasoned with them from the scripture. So he was asked to come back. He was there 3 weeks running on a Saturday, Saturday after Sabbath. Saturday, 3 Sabbaths, where he was given the opportunity to be able to open up the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and look at these messianic prophecies that spoke about the expectant Messiah that was to come, the Christ, and to be able to show them that was Jesus, who they completely rejected and who they missed in his first coming. And that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to reason from the scriptures, and the fact that it says here that he was reasoning with them, this meant it would have been in some sort of format where it would have been like a Q&A, where he would have taken these messianic verses. He would have given the audience an opportunity to be able to dialogue with him. And of course, he was on the other side of the argument, wasn't he? Just a few years before this, where he would have been passionately against this, but he was able to use his knowledge of being a Pharisee. And of course, now that he had his eyes opened and given this new heart and ears to hear, eyes to see, a heart to receive, he was able to now point these scriptures, rightly so, to the Lord Jesus Christ, for fulfillment of the expectant Messiah. And that's exactly what he was doing. Verse 3, explaining and setting before them that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus who I am proclaiming to you is that Christ. You missed him. You're still waiting for the Messiah to come. Well, he's already come the first time round. He's going to be coming back again in his second coming. And we're still waiting for Jesus to return today, aren't we? 2,000 years later. But the first coming, when he came 2,000 years ago, these Jews here in his synagogue, they completely missed him. And Paul's doing his best here to say that Jesus had to suffer. That's what all of these messianic prophecies were saying, and he's already came. He is that Christ. Verse 4, and some of them, having listened to him for these 3 Saturdays in a row, some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a great multitude of the God-fearing Greeks, of the proselytes, and some of the Jews, and some of the leading women. These were upper-class proselyte women as well, and of course the Gentiles, like we always see as well. These were the Lord was at work in these people's lives, and some of them were persuaded, and including a great multitude. So a remnant of a small number of Jews and a great multitude of the God-fearing Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. So that sort of shows you the ratio and the proportions of each group that was responding to the gospel. And then there is a gap. Verse 4, verse 5, if you didn't know any better, you would just read that without even taking a breath. But there's actually a gap here because, and we know that Paul and Silas spent longer than 3 Sabbaths in Thessalonica, because he writes about this and he gives thanks to the church in Philippi for supporting him and sending financial aid whilst he was there. Twice, in fact. This is in Philippians chapter 4, verse 15. So we know that he was there for longer than 3 weeks. It was here where the church was planted, and it was during this time that the Pharisees and the Jews of the synagogue, those that wasn't persuaded to follow the Messiah, they became jealous. Verse 5, and they didn't just become jealous and go off sulking. They did what so often happened. They wanted to silence Paul, just like they wanted to silence Jesus, like they wanted to silence Peter and the apostles when they were preaching in the temple. They became jealous, and what was their plan? Well, they went and looked for the renter mob. And believe it or not, this was a category of this was a career where you could be a riotous man and you were available to hire. There was all sorts of careers like this. There was actually professional wailers as well, where when people were buried, so you could hire some professional wailers to come and who would cry out and be very passionate and sob for the person who had died. And here you could rent a riotous group of people, somebody who was going to come and cause all sorts of problems. And if you're into your politics, you might even recognize this today. There's all sorts of mobs that can be hired today whenever there's something that's, at a high temperature politically. Often you see these groups of people come about and look to cause trouble at all sorts of times. Well, this is the case here. These Jews went and hired these wicked men from the marketplace. And these men that was, just hanging around and waiting for their next opportunity to form a mob and to cause trouble, the renter mob in a city, and to cause an uproar. And what did they do? Well, they wanted to go and find Paul and Silas, and because they couldn't, the next best thing was to find the person that was showing hospitality towards Paul and Silas, and that is Jason. That's who we're about to meet right now. Jason was hosting Paul and Silas. They were staying with him during their time in Thessalonica, and as a result of them not being able to find Paul and Silas themselves, what did they do? Having gone to the house where they knew they were staying, they couldn't find him. So they started attacking the house. Verse 5, in attacking the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out to the assembly. They wanted to go and grab Paul and Silas, bring them out. Of course, what's going to happen is going to be false charges, just like there always is. There's going to be a kangaroo court, and they're going to try causing all sorts of trouble for them again, aren't they? And ideally, they'll either be killed or brought to an inch of their life, like we've already seen multiple times. They just want them to disappear, to be getting rid of. And when they did not find them, verse 6, they began dragging Jason and some brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have upset the world have come here also." That's the charge. Those that were part of this first church here in Thessalonica, which would have included Jason and those that responded to those 3 Sabbaths, who have now separated themselves and become a part of the church, maybe even at Jason's house. They've now dragged these men out, and the accusation is these men are going around upsetting the whole world. And the whole world, of course, is the only world that they're worried about here is the Roman Empire, and they've come here also. And Jason, verse 7, has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. Now, if you're going to get the Romans on board and engaged with, wanting to bring some sort of harsh judgment against somebody, you've got to attack them where it hurts, and that's going to be over money, more or less over taxes, or over authority. And as soon as you start challenging that, and here they're saying, well, they're going around saying there's another king other than Caesar. Well, guess what? You're going to get Rome's attention, because they're going to squash that really, really quickly. Everyone knows that. So this renter mob and the Pharisees, the Jews from the synagogue, they know exactly how to get them on board. So they've gone up to the assembly in Rome and said, guess what? They're going around trying to cause trouble, saying there's another king, not Caesar, the King Jesus. And of course, what they're going to do? They're going to be disturbed by that. That's what it says in verse 8. And they disturbed the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things. This is effectively accusing them of treason. So what do? Well, of course, they're going to want to silence them, aren't they? So when they had received the bond from Jason and the others, they released them. What's that mean? Well, they looked for guarantees. They said to Jason, you need to get rid of these guys. Paul and Silas, these troublemakers, they need to disappear. And to make sure that that's going to happen, we're going to take some sort of security off of you, whether it be your house or your business, some sort of financial element. And if they come back, guess what? You're losing everything. So the stakes suddenly become extremely high. They deal with it in two ways, either violence or financially. Here, there was this financial penalty saying, if they come back, guess what? You're losing everything. And of course, we see that play out because when Paul writes to the church here in Thessalonica in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, he mentions that he wants to come back, but he knows that he can't because if he was to come back, he was going to put Jason in all sorts of trouble financially. And now, as they leave here, they're being forced to leave here, both Paul and Silas, and of course Timothy as well. But Timothy's out of range here, and ideally so, because it's Timothy, because he's not involved with the charges here for whatever reason. Timothy wasn't a part of that. Timothy is able and allowed to go back to the church in Thessalonica, which is how the report gets back to him. But we'll get back to it. We don't want to jump the gun, but Timothy does come back to this early church. Paul hasn't spent as much time here as he would have wanted to in terms of, teaching them doctrine, teaching them the scriptures, making sure that they had a robust and theological understanding about the Lord. That's the reason why there are these 2 letters sent, because there are lots of things that they're unsure about in terms of the resurrection and the rapture and all sorts of questions that come out of this church in Thessalonica. That's why Paul addresses these issues and questions in 1 and 2 Thessalonians. So if you're looking for any homework today, now would be a great time, because you've got all of the context as to this church that was just planted in Thessalonica. Go and read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, because that is Paul's attempt to be able to go and teach them in his absence of not being allowed to go back there, having been moved off. And that's exactly what happens here. Verse 9, when they had received the bond from Jason, so Jason's given his financial guarantee, and the others, they released them. And of course now Paul and Silas now head off to their next destination. Hopefully that's helpful. If you do have any thoughts, comments or reflections, as always, do let me know in the comments below, and I very much look forward to being with you again tomorrow. Bye for now.